way the story coaching technique works, a performer will tell a story. And then after they tell that story, or read written work, it works for written work as well, the performer then is in charge of how much feedback they want to get from their audience. And this works, sometimes there are groups of people that meet together, kind of a story circle, or writers that get together at a certain time, at the library or another place to practice their written work or share their written work with other writers. And so the way it works is the teller or the writer tells or reads their story. Then they can decide if all they want is applause, then they go to the first step here and they get some applause and the audience claps and then they're done and that's all they want. And that's okay. You don't have to get any more feedback than that. If all you want is applause, you just go to the first step, do the applause, and then you're done. And maybe someday down the road you want to get more feedback. But if all you want is applause, that's perfectly fine. If you want more feedback from your audience, the second step is to have the teller ask teller questions. And that's where a teller would say, in this story, in the story about why the animals were complaining, could you envision where the animals were? Was that clear enough to you? Would you have liked me to add more details about where the animals were standing when they were talking to each other? And then as an audience member, you can't give any suggestions yet. All you can do is answer the question that the teller asks you. And if that's all the teller wants is to ask a couple of questions of the audience to get feedback, then they sit down, they can be all the way done. Or if they want more feedback, they can go on to the third step. And then the third step is audience questions. And that's where members of the audience could ask questions about a story, but of course as questions they have to start with what, why, or how. They can't be suggestions yet, only questions from the audience. So you might ask a question like, why did the cow start the conversation? I would think it would be another animal that would start that whole conversation in the story about why, about Snail's treasure. You can ask questions and then the teller can say, well, I thought about it this way. Or, I tried that once and it didn't quite work for me for this reason, so I decided to go this way with the story. And the teller can answer questions that the audience shares. And if they want to be done at that point, they can just sit down and be done, or they can go on to the last step, and that's the suggestions from the audience. And naturally, our inclination tends to be, whenever we're giving feedback, that we jump right to suggestions. Do this, change that, change that. And especially if you're newer to writing or newer to storytelling, if people bury you under suggestions, you'll think you're not very good and you might quit. It might be so discouraging that you'll quit. And so this tool is really set up so that even beginning tellers can get the feedback they need and get some feedback from the audience, but not feel like they're going to be buried on all kinds of suggestions right away. And so that's sort of how this works. Any questions about sort of the format here and how it works? Okay. Would anyone like to tell their story in front of the group and get some feedback? It's okay if no one does. I can certainly play that role too. But does anyone want to try out their story in front of a bigger group here as an option? Okay. Yeah. No worries. No worries. I planned for this. So there are a whole series of stories. Oh, we have some encouraging going here. Okay. And later on, after I do it and we go through the steps, if someone wants to volunteer then, that's fine too. There's no rush. There's a whole series of stories about a holy man called the Mullah Nasruddin, or the Hoja Nasruddin. And it's a story that's told often in Islamic areas of the Middle East, so Turkey, Iran, Iraq, those areas would have told these sorts of stories. And they're all fairly short stories, but all about Mullah Nasruddin, and he was a wise fool. He was always doing things that were silly, but in the end, they were wise. A long time ago, Mullah Nasruddin was sitting in a garden, and he was looking out over all the plants in the garden, and he saw the watermelons sitting there with their vines stretching across the garden. And then he looked up above him, and he was leaning up against a mulberry tree with its little tiny mulberry fruits. And he thought to himself, now why in the world would the Creator make a huge, strong tree like this with tiny little fruit, but that watermelon over there with those great big fruit, those fruits are growing on weak vines. Now why in the world wouldn't the Creator put a large piece of fruit on a big, strong tree? And as he was thinking about all this, one of those mulberries fell down and landed right at his forehead. And Mullah Nasruddin smiled and he said, ah, now I see the reason. And that's the end of the story. So there's an example, so let's go through all the steps here. So we'll start with the applause part. Excellent, you did the applause part, very good. Now if I wanted to be done, I could be all done, I don't have to get any more feedback. But let's go on to the teller questions. Let's see. Was the setting for the story clear enough, or should I have spent more time describing where the mullah was at this time, or could you kind of imagine in your head the setting for the story?
I thought you might have described more plants. Were there only the 2 plants? That was the picture that I was not quite getting.
Good point, good point. Yeah, I only described a few of them, but yeah, it was at gardens, there were several plants growing there. That's a good point. Okay, good. Let's see, we can move on then down to audience questions. Do you have any questions for me about this story?
How big was the berry tree?
Oh, the mulberry tree? It was, let's see, mulberry trees can get to be, 10 or 15 feet tall. So it was a pretty hefty tree. We think of mulberry bushes, which are real common in Europe, but in other places, some of them can grow to be bigger. And so this would be sort of tree size. So I think of not quite as big as like a great big maple or oak, but a little smaller than that, but still a pretty hefty tree. Yeah. Okay, let's go down to suggestions. Any suggestions from the group about ways to improve or strengthen the story, or things you would have liked to have heard or seen that weren't in there?
You're the professional, we can't.
I know, no, that's okay. No, and this is a story I don't tell a lot, so I always tell stories that I haven't performed a whole lot, so there'll definitely be things in there. So, think about, as a listener or audience member, what would you have liked to have seen? And it's okay to...
I would have liked to have had a little more description of the watermelon.
Okay, sure, yeah, that's a good point. And this being a story, I tell this story, I probably told it 4 times in my life. A lot of the other stories I'm performing as part of the workshop, I tell them, every year I tell them, 10, 15 times. And so you can see this story was a lot more stark. I didn't have a lot of detail in it, and you see that in the story. And so,
would he prefer to eat watermelon, or would he prefer to eat mulberries? That's another question.
That's an excellent question, yeah, with Mullah and Nasruddin. Yeah, I was trying to imagine a watermelon and a tree falling on your head.
Yeah, that part you would get very clearly.
Right, that's the realization chunk there. But and I used to use this story a lot when I worked as a naturalist, talking about adaptations. Is that there's an idea in ecology that sort of nature knows best. That if an animal or plant grows a certain way, it's for a good reason. And this story, it came from a different angle, talking about the creator and why the creator made a plant a certain way. But it's the same sort of idea that plants and animals are built for a certain way of living, and that there's probably good reasons why we don't have watermelons falling out of trees on our heads.